The council chamber was quiet. 47 different species sat in their seats, watching the screen at the front of the room. On the screen, a tired woman spoke into a camera. Her skin was gray, and her hands shook. She was the leader of the mining colony on Kresh 9, a frozen moon far from any major trade routes. Behind her, medical staff moved between beds filled with the sick and dying. The plague had come 3 weeks ago. Nobody knew where it started. One day the colony was fine, and the next day people were falling sick. The symptoms were terrible. Fever, bleeding, organ failure. The doctors tried everything they knew, but nothing worked. The plague spread through the air, through touch, through everything. 2,000 people had already died. Only 900 remained alive, and most of them were infected. The woman on the screen did not beg. She did not cry. She simply asked the council to remember the names of those who died here. Then she thanked them for their honesty about what would happen next. The screen went dark. The vote had already been taken. Evacuation was impossible. The plague was too dangerous. If even one infected person left the moon, the disease could spread to other worlds. Millions could die. The council had decided to seal the colony. They would send supplies and medicine to make the dying easier. Then they would shut down all communication. The colony would become a grave. Every council member had voted yes. Every member except one. The human representative sat at the back of the room. He was an older man with white hair and deep lines around his eyes. He had not voted yes. He had not voted no. He had simply refused to vote at all. The other council members left the chamber. They had other business to attend to, other problems to solve. The decision about Kresh 9 was finished. There was nothing more to discuss. But the human did not leave. He sat in his chair, staring at the blank screen, his face showing nothing. After a long time, he pulled out a small device and began typing. His fingers moved slowly, pressing each button with care. He was not writing to the council. He was not filing an official complaint. He was sending a message to his cousin, a woman who owned a small shipping company on the edge of civilized space. The message was short. It contained coordinates, a situation report, and a request. His cousin read the message and called an emergency meeting with her crew. They gathered in the ship's common room, 7 people in total. She explained the situation. A colony was dying. The council had abandoned them. She wanted to go help. She made it clear that this was volunteer only. Anyone who went might get infected. Anyone who went might be turned away from every port in the galaxy. Anyone who went might never come home. All 7 crew members raised their hands. The ship left port 18 hours later. It was old, held together with patches and prayers. The faster-than-light drive made strange noises that worried the engineer. The life support system sometimes forgot to regulate temperature properly. But the ship could fly, and that was all that mattered. The crew loaded medical equipment into the cargo hold. Experimental technology that had never been tested outside a laboratory. The council found out about the ship when it was already halfway to Kresh 9. Emergency meetings were called. Angry messages were sent. The human representative was brought before a special tribunal to explain what had happened. He stood in front of them, his hands behind his back, and listened to their accusations. They said he was reckless. They said he was putting the entire galaxy at risk. They said he had no authority to send a rescue mission. They said that even if the ship reached Kresh 9, there was nothing they could do. The plague was too strong. The colonists were already dead. All the human ship would accomplish was adding 7 more bodies to the count. The human representative listened to everything they said. Then he spoke. His voice was calm and quiet. He told them about human history. He told them about firefighters who ran into burning buildings to save strangers. He told them about Coast Guard crews who sailed into hurricanes to rescue people lost at sea. He told them about doctors who worked in epidemic zones with nothing but thin masks and hope. He explained that humans had faced many plagues in their history, diseases that killed millions, diseases that seemed unstoppable. But humans had never responded by walking away. They had responded by running toward the problem with everything they had. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes they died. But they tried, because the alternative was unacceptable. The tribunal asked him what evolutionary purpose this behavior served. How had humanity survived if they constantly threw themselves into danger for strangers? What logical advantage did such reckless compassion provide? The human representative smiled, a sad expression that made him look even older. He said that maybe it was not logical. Maybe it was not smart. But it was human. He said that his species had learned long ago that the strength of a civilization was not measured by how well it protected itself. It was measured by who it protected when protection was difficult. He told them about a man who had jumped into a frozen river to save a child, who had fallen through the ice. The man had died from the cold. The child had survived. When they asked the man why he jumped, in the moments before he died, he said he had not thought about it. He had just seen someone who needed help, and his body had moved. That was what humans did, the representative explained. They moved before thinking. They helped before calculating. They stayed when logic said to run. It was not always smart. It was not always successful. But it was who they were. The tribunal was silent for a long time. Then they delivered their judgment. Any ship that landed on Creche 9 would be quarantined permanently. Any survivors would be banned from council space. The mining colony would remain sealed. The human representative nodded and left the chamber. He returned to his quarters and opened a bottle of old whiskey. He poured a glass and stood by his window, looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there, his cousin's ship was getting closer to Creche 9. Somewhere out there, 900 people were waiting to die. And somewhere out there, 7 humans were refusing to accept that outcome. The council thought it was over. They thought the humans would fail, and then everyone would understand that some battles could not be won. But the human representative knew something they did not. He knew that humans had never cared much about whether a battle could be won. They only cared about whether it was worth fighting. The ship entered Creche 9's atmosphere the next day. Automated satellites still orbited the moon, their cameras still recording. The council members who bothered to watch saw the ship descend through clouds of frozen methane. They saw it land near the colony's main entrance. They saw small figures emerge, carrying equipment and moving toward the airlock where colonists waited. The council could not hear what was being said. They could not see faces through the protective suits, but they could see the moment when the two groups met. They could see the way the colonists reached out, the way the ship's crew reached back, the way they held each other despite the danger. It was not logical. It was not smart. But there was something in that moment that made even the oldest species in the council pause and wonder. The ship's medical bay was small and never meant for serious disease work. The captain stood in the doorway, looking at the space they had tried to convert into a laboratory. Equipment that cost more than the ship itself sat on makeshift tables. 3 crew members with basic medical training were trying to set up quarantine fields. The rest of the crew was outside, helping colonists move the sick into isolation areas. The captain was 53 years old. She had spent her entire adult life in space, hauling cargo to places most people had never heard of. She had survived engine failures, pirate attacks, and a near collision with an asteroid. But standing here, looking at equipment she barely understood, trying to save people from a disease that had already killed thousands, she felt fear like never before. A Veltian doctor came through the airlock. She was the colony's head of medicine. the same woman who had made the final transmission to the council. She carried sealed containers holding samples of infected tissue. Her hands trembled as she passed them through the decontamination field. She had watched most of her friends die. She had stopped believing in hope. But here were humans, strangers who spoke a different language and breathed different air, risking everything to help. The ship's medical officer took the samples. He was 26 years old and had graduated from medical school only 2 years ago. He had joined the crew because he was bored with safe, comfortable work on a core world. Now he stood holding vials of the deadliest disease anyone had seen in decades, and he wondered if boredom might have been underrated. He disappeared into the converted lab and began work. The equipment was experimental, built on theories that most species considered impossible. It could analyze disease structures at the molecular level and design custom antibody treatments in hours instead of years. The problem was that it had never been tested outside controlled environments. The medical officer fed the samples into the machine and prayed to gods he did not believe in. 11 hours later, he was still working. The rest of the crew brought him food that he did not eat and water that he occasionally drank. The machine hummed and calculated, breaking down the plague structure piece by piece. The medical officer watched data scroll across screens, looking for weaknesses, for patterns, for anything that could be exploited. The plague was not natural. That became clear within the first few hours of analysis. Someone had built it, either as a weapon or as an experiment that went wrong. The disease had been carefully designed to spread quickly and resist normal treatment. But designed things had flaws that natural things did not. Evolution smoothed away weaknesses over millions of years. Engineering left cracks. The medical officer found those cracks. He began programming the synthesizer to create antibodies, tiny biological machines that would hunt down and destroy the plague organisms. The process was complex, requiring adjustments every few minutes as the simulation showed how the plague might mutate in response. But slowly, carefully, he built a treatment that might work. Outside the ship, the colony was struggling through another day. The survivors had been divided into groups. The dying, who were too far gone to save. The infected, who might still have a chance. And the lucky ones, 47 people, who had somehow avoided exposure. That last group was smallest, huddled in a sealed section of the residential complex, running out of food and hoped the crew organized supply runs. They put on their protective suits, checked every seal twice, and walked through streets where bodies lay frozen in methane snow. They carried containers of food and medicine to the sealed section. They spoke to people through intercoms, trying to sound confident and calm when they felt neither. A young boy watched them from behind a window. He was Kresh, a species known for their mathematical minds and logical thinking. He was 8 years old. His parents had died 3 days ago. He had not cried, because Kresh children were taught that emotions solve nothing. But watching the humans move through the dangerous streets, carrying supplies and hope, something inside him broke. He pressed his small hand against the cold window and wondered why strangers had come when everyone else had given up. 20 hours after starting work, the medical officer emerged from the lab. He looked like he had aged 10 years. His eyes were red and his hands shook from exhaustion. But he carried a module loaded with the first batch of antibody treatment. It was not a cure. It was a chance. The treatment needed to be given within 48 hours of infection to work properly. For those who had been sick longer, it might ease their suffering. For those newly exposed, it might save their lives. The Velthian doctor volunteered to be the first to receive the treatment. She had been exposed so many times that she probably already had the plague in her system. If the treatment failed, she would die. If it succeeded, she would be proof that the human technology worked. She lay down in an isolation ward and let the medical officer inject the treatment into her bloodstream. The antibodies spread through her body, seeking out and destroying plague organisms. She closed her eyes and waited. 8 hours passed. Her vital signs stabilized. The plague markers in her blood began to drop. It was not instant. It was not dramatic. It was slow, painful progress measured in small improvements. But it was progress. The captain sent a coded message back to the human representative on the council station. The message was simple. Treatment works, proceeding with distribution. The council intercepted the transmission. More emergency meetings were called. Some members argued for sending help. Others insisted the quarantine must remain. The debate raged for hours. The human representative said nothing during the debate. He simply pulled up the satellite feed and let them watch. The screen showed the ship's crew moving through the colony, administering treatments, setting up medical stations, refusing to give up even as their own supplies ran low. A Taurian counselor finally spoke. Her species valued logic above all else. She asked the question everyone was thinking. Why would humans risk so much for strangers? What evolutionary advantage did such behavior provide? How had humanity survived long enough to reach the stars if they constantly threw themselves into danger? The human representative thought about his answer. Then he told them another story from Earth. A story about a man who jumped into a frozen river to save someone who fell through the ice. The man died from the cold. The person he saved was a complete stranger. Before he died, the man said he had not thought about it. He saw someone who needed help, and his body moved before his brain could calculate the odds. That, the human explained, was the foundation of human civilization. Not intelligence, not technology, not even survival instinct. Just the simple, illogical certainty that when someone needed help, you helped them. Even if it cost everything. The council chamber fell silent. The satellite feed continued to play, showing humans working through another shift, another day, another desperate attempt to save lives that the galaxy had already mourned. By the 7th day, the ship was running on reserves. The medical synthesizers had been working non-stop, producing antibody treatments faster than anyone could distribute them. The ship's power supply, designed to last 3 months under normal use, was down to 18 days. The captain gathered her crew in the common area and explained the situation. They could leave now, taking the survivors who were healthy enough to travel, and hoped the remaining colonists could manage with the treatments already distributed. Or they could stay until everyone was treated, knowing that doing so would drain their power beyond the point of safe return. The crew would be stuck in orbit around Kresh 9 with no way to reach a refueling station. The crew voted. All 7 hands went up. They would stay. The medical officer trained others to administer the treatments. The Velfian doctor, recovered enough to work again, learned quickly. 2 human colonists joined them, grateful to be useful after days of feeling helpless. They moved through the colony together, checking patients, giving injections, monitoring vital signs. The work was endless, but the results were undeniable. People were surviving. The colony's infrastructure slowly came back online. Power generators were repaired by survivors who had regained their strength. Water recycling systems were cleaned and restarted. The dead were gathered and given proper burials in the frozen ground. It was not the colony it had been before the plague, but it was alive. That was something. The young Kresh boy began following the medical officer during his rounds. He did not talk much, but he carried supplies and learned to check vital signs. The medical officer, exhausted beyond measure, found comfort in the boy's quiet presence. They worked side by side, human and alien, saving lives with determination and hope. On the 10th day, the first critical patient recovered enough to leave intensive care. She was a human mining engineer who had been among the earliest infected. The plague had nearly destroyed her lungs. The treatment had given her body the tools to rebuild them cell by cell. She sat up in her bed and asked how many others had survived. The medical officer told her the truth. They had lost over 2,000 people, but they had saved 937. Every person who received the treatment in time had lived. The news spread through the colony like fire. Hope, that dangerous thing the council had tried to kill with their quarantine order, bloomed again. Survivors began to believe they might actually live, that the humans who came for them might actually succeed. That giving up was not the only option. The council, watching from their distant station, could not ignore what was happening. The satellite feeds showed a colony being reborn. The data showed infection rates dropping to zero. The human representative sat in the council gallery during every session, saying nothing, just existing as a reminder that logic was not the only way to solve problems. A faction began to form among council members. They were species who had their own stories of survival, their own histories of overcoming impossible odds. They remembered what it was like to be young civilizations, struggling and desperate. They looked at the humans working on Creche 9 and saw something they had lost. They began to argue for reversing the quarantine. The opposition was fierce. The Taurian counselor, who had questioned human evolution, stood firm. The quarantine was based on sound science. The plague might mutate. The treatments might fail. Allowing ships to leave Creche 9 could trigger a pandemic across the galaxy. She presented models and data that showed terrible possible futures. The human representative finally spoke again. He did not argue with the data. He did not say the Taurian was wrong. Instead, he pointed out that every projection assumed the only response to a plague was to run away, that the only way to stop a pandemic was isolation and abandonment. But humans had learned different lessons from their history. He explained that Earth had developed ways of dealing with plagues that relied on running toward the problem, not away from it. Mobile medical teams, quick vaccine development, aggressive treatment. These methods did not always work, but they worked often enough that humanity had stopped seeing plagues as automatic death sentences. The technology on Creche 9 was built on centuries of that experience. The debate continued for days. Meanwhile, on Creche 9, the ship's power dropped below 10 days. The captain ran calculations and made hard decisions. They would need to leave soon, or they would not leave at all. She called the crew together and explained. They had done what they came to do. The colony had treatments. The trained medical staff could continue the work. It was time to go. The medical officer objected. There were still 200 patients in critical condition. Leaving now meant some would die. The captain understood, but she also understood that her crew dying in orbit would not help anyone. They had to trust that they had done enough. The Creche boy heard the conversation. He found the medical officer later, alone in the lab. The boy spoke for the first time in days. He said that his people believed debts could never be fully repaid, only honored through action. He said that what the humans had done would be remembered by every Creche child born on this colony. He said that humans had taught him that giving up was a choice, not a requirement. The medical officer knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. He explained that they were not giving up, just passing responsibility to others. He explained that being strong did not mean fighting every battle alone. He explained that trust was part of strength, too. The boy nodded, understanding in the way children sometimes do, seeing straight to the heart of things. The ship prepared to leave. Survivors who could stand gathered at windows and external cameras to watch. The council watched, too. Their debate paused to witness the moment. The human representative sat in his usual spot, his face finally showing something that might have been satisfaction. The ship's engines fired, throwing up clouds of frozen methane. It lifted slowly, struggling with power reserves that were never meant to be pushed so low. As it climbed toward orbit, every council member knew that something had changed. The question was no longer whether humans were logical. The question was whether the galaxy was ready for a species that refused to surrender, that stayed strong long after everyone else had walked away. The ship hung in orbit around Kresh 9. Power reserves at 7 days. The captain stared at her navigation display and calculated routes to the nearest refueling station. The numbers were bad. They would need to drop out of faster-than-light travel at least twice to save energy, turning a 3-day journey into 12. Their power would run out halfway there. She began writing a distress signal, knowing it probably would not be answered by anyone who cared about council rules. In the council chamber, something unexpected happened. The Toying counselor requested the floor. She presented a new analysis that her team had spent 3 days completing. The analysis showed that the plague, while still dangerous, had been contained to Kresh 9. The human treatments had not just saved lives, but had stopped the disease from spreading. The risk of a pandemic, while not zero, was now similar to dozens of other diseases that moved through council space regularly. She recommended changing the quarantine to allow limited travel with proper medical checks. The chamber erupted. Some called it surrender. Others called it common sense. The human representative stayed silent, watching as the council struggled with a decision that would define how they handled future crises. Finally, the senior arbiter called for a vote. The measure passed, but barely. Ships could leave Kresh 9 if they submitted to medical examination and carried proper safety equipment. The first ship to volunteer for rescue was not human. It was Kresh, a medical vessel sent by the boys' homeworld when they finally learned what had happened. The Kresh were not warriors or explorers, but they took care of their own, and 937 of their people were alive because humans had refused to accept defeat. The medical vessel was fast and well supplied. The freight captain watched the Kresh vessel approach on her sensors. She had expected anger when the council learned of their mission. She had expected punishment or indifference. She had not expected rescue. The Kresh captain sent a message that was translated through 6 different systems before reaching her console. The message was simple. No one who saves lives should die for it. The Kresh vessel matched orbit and began the power transfer. It was delicate work, connecting 2 ships that were never designed to work together. But the Kresh were natural engineers, and they made it work. The freight ship's reserves began to climb. The captain felt tension leave her chest, a weight she had been carrying since they first launched this impossible mission. On Kresh 9, the colony continued to heal. The Velthian doctor worked long shifts, giving treatments and teaching others. The young Kresh boy became her assistant, his small hands steadier than many adults when doing delicate work. The infection rate dropped to 0. The last critical patient stabilized. The colony that the council had declared dead began making plans for the future. More ships arrived. Not many, but enough. A human merchant vessel carrying food and building supplies. A Delphian science ship with researchers who wanted to study the treatment methods. Even a Torlian diplomatic ship, sent by the counselor herself, carrying official papers showing the quarantine had been modified. Each arrival was met with tears and gratitude and a growing sense that something fundamental had shifted. The freight ship, its power restored, prepared to depart for real. The captain wrote a message to the colony, searching for the right words. She settled on simple ones. Stay strong. The response came from the Velthian doctor. Just 2 words. We learned. The human representative was called before council for a formal inquiry. The charges were presented. Unauthorized military action, violation of quarantine, reckless endangerment of galactic security. He stood in the center of the chamber, alone, and listened to each accusation. When they finished, he was given a chance to defend himself. He spoke for less than 5 minutes. He said that humans had a saying, if you can, you must. If you can save a life, you must try. If you can prevent suffering, you must act. If you can offer hope, you must give it freely. He said that the freight crew had not broken any human law. They had simply done what humans do when people need help. He said that if the council chose to punish them for that, then the council was revealing more about itself than about humanity. The chamber was silent. The senior arbiter leaned forward and asked whether humanity believed compassion was more important than security. The human representative shook his head. He explained that humans did not see them as opposite things. True security came from building a civilization where no one was abandoned, where the strong helped the weak, not because they had to, but because they understood that strength meant nothing if only used for yourself. The council left to decide. 2 hours later, they returned. The senior arbiter delivered the verdict. The charges were dismissed. The freight crew would receive formal awards for their service. The human representative was appointed to head a new committee on emergency medical response. And the council's charter was changed to include a new rule that abandoning populated worlds in crisis should be considered only as an absolute last resort. The changes spread through council space over the following months. Medical supplies were stored at key stations. Quick response teams were trained and equipped. The technology the humans had brought to Creche 9 was studied, improved, and shared with member species. It was not a revolution, but it was a beginning. It was recognition that there were ways to respond to crisis that did not require writing off lives as acceptable losses. The freight ship returned to its normal work, hauling cargo through the outer rim. The crew rarely spoke about Creche 9, but they carried something new with them. A certainty, maybe. Knowledge that when faced with impossible choices, humans chose the difficult path over the easy one. That surrender was always possible, but never the only option. The young creche boy grew up to become a doctor. He specialized in pandemic response, spending his career developing better treatments and faster intervention methods. He kept a picture on his desk, taken from satellite feed, showing the freight ship landing on Creche 9's frozen surface. When students asked about it, he told them about the day he learned that strength was not about never falling down. It was about refusing to stay down, about staying strong when everyone else had walked away. The council's rule change remained in the charter. Future crises tested it, as all principles are tested. Sometimes the galaxy lived up to the new standard. Sometimes it failed. But there was a shift, subtle but real, in how the council approached disaster. They asked not just whether helping was logical, but whether abandonment was something they could live with. Whether they wanted to build a civilization that measured success only in survival, or one that measured it in who they saved along the way. The human representative eventually retired and returned to Earth. He spent his final years teaching young diplomats about the day the galaxy learned that humans never surrender. He told them it was not about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. It was about understanding that walking away was sometimes the hardest choice and almost never the right one. The freight captain attended his funeral, along with the Velthian doctor and the creche boy who had become a man. They did not speak much, but they understood each other the way people who have shared impossible moments always do. They carried his memory back to their corners of the galaxy, proof that one person refusing to accept defeat could change everything. Creche 9 eventually became more than a mining colony. It became a symbol. Other worlds facing disaster looked at what happened there and saw hope. Saw that the gap between catastrophe and survival was sometimes measured not in resources or technology, but in whether anyone cared enough to try. The colony grew, its population increasing, its story becoming legend. On distant Station Meridian, in the observation deck where 47 species had once gathered to watch a colony die, there stood a memorial. It listed the names of those who had been lost, as the Velthian administrator had requested, but it also listed the names of those who had come to help. 7 humans in an old freight ship, one Kresh medical vessel, one Torlian counselor who had changed her mind, one human representative who had refused to vote for abandonment. The words carved into the memorial were simple. They had been argued over for weeks before everyone agreed. In the end, they used words the human representative had spoken during that first emergency session. Words that had seemed impossible at the time, but had proven true. Surrender is a choice. Choose differently.